Who's up for a little bookshelf background? Anyone? Anyone? Bookshelf background? Anyone? Anyone? Okay. I know the other day I said I was going to be vlogging regularly a few feet to my right, but I thought I'd try some different things and see what works. So today we're going to try the bookshelf background, appropriately enough because I'm going to be reviewing Dear Mr. Henshaw by Beverly Cleary. Cleary? Clary? I don't know. So I would hazard a guess that most of you had to read this book at some point in elementary school. Dear Mr. Henshaw is, I think, probably the first book that I remember reading and really enjoying. I read it, I'm pretty sure, when I was in second grade. Not only was Dear Mr. Henshaw one of my first favorite books, but it was also one of the first books where I encountered indirect storytelling. In other words, a story being told by an alternate medium, not just straight out telling you the story like you find in most books, but in this case, telling it through letters. Lee Botts, this guy, loves the author Mr. Henshaw, and he starts writing him letters upon hearing one of his favorite books read to him in second grade. And he continues those letters off and on for the next few years, taking us finally into the 6th grade. The story is told entirely from these letters written by Lee, and also from a personal diary that he starts keeping. It's a great medium for storytelling, and I have a reasonable amount of respect for people who are able to do it and do it well. Because the thing about telling a story entirely by letters, or emails, or instant messages, or whatever, is that your subject matter is extremely limited. You can't just go out and say, this happened. You have to find an excuse for your character to write, this happened. It becomes even more difficult when dialogue enters into the equation because, I mean, how many of us actually write actual dialogue in our letters? Lee Botts wants to be a writer, like Mr. Henshaw, and of course, when he asked Mr. Henshaw for advice for young writers, one of the first pieces of advice, the most important pieces of advice that he is given is write. And so he writes letters to Mr. Henshaw, and eventually he starts keeping his own personal diary. And the story follows him through his struggle, not only to write a good story, but also kind of to find himself. I mean, he's at that age. He's starting adolescence where kids are starting to find themselves. And this is made all the more difficult by the fact that his parents have just divorced, his father is a trucker and he's always gone and he's not very reliable and he doesn't call, and so he's going through a really hard time. That and the fact that he's the new kid in school and nobody really likes him, he doesn't have any friends. And so that, more than anything, is probably why he writes a lot more letters in the 6th grade than he does in any of the other grades. In fact, I think he just writes one letter for each of the other grades, and then the rest of the story is his 6th grade letters. And so his letters and his diary entries follow him through this year of struggles and disappointments and all of the angsty things that go on for a boy in the 6th grade. And there's a lot of really nice things that happen here, and they all kind of relate with this theme of telling a story and being able to write well. And one of the things is when Lee first starts his diary, he's not quite sure how to do it. He's used to writing to a person. He's used to writing to Mr. Henshaw, who he knows is an actual real person, and he can't quite wrap his mind around the idea of just writing something down in a book. And so for a little while he's addressing all of his journal entries to Mr. Henshaw. He doesn't actually mail them, but he writes, "Dear pretend Mr. Henshaw." And there comes a point in the novel when he doesn't need to do that anymore. When he realizes that he can write down these journal entries without having to write them to someone. Additionally, Lee spends a lot of the year trying to write a story of his own. And he tries out all these story ideas, these fictional story ideas that just aren't working because he still can't quite figure out how to tell a story. And so finally what he ends up doing, in basically an act of desperation, is just writing down a story about a day in his life that he particularly enjoyed. And in doing that, he realizes that that's the kind of thing that he needs to be writing. Real, everyday things that mean something to him. One other subplot in this book is that Lee has problems with his lunch being stolen. His mom works for a catering company, and so very often he'll have these very tasty treats in his lunch, but they keep getting stolen. And for about the first half of the year, he's moping and whining about how his lunch is getting stolen. He's always scowling. That's part of the reason why he doesn't have any friends. But then sometime in the middle of the year, about the same time that he stops addressing his diary entries to Mr. Henshaw, he decides to do something about it. And not only do his lunches stop being stolen, he actually gains a few friends out of it. And so what we see in Dear Mr. Henshaw ultimately is a year in the life, a pivotal year in the life of this very troubled young boy. It's an excellent book. It's short. I think I sat and read it in about the span of 2 hours. But it's an excellent book. It is still on my favorites list. And if you didn't read this book in elementary school, I highly recommend that you find a copy and read it because it is very, very good. And the next book review is going to be An Abundance of Catherines by John Green. See you then.